Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Today we are going to talk about functions. A function is a chunk of code that can be referenced by a name and is almost like a small self-contained mini program. Functions can help reduce repetitions and make code easier to follow. In JavaScript, functions are considered to be first-class objects. This means they behave in the same way as all the other primitive data types and objects in the language. They can be assigned to variable, they can be stored in arrays, and can even be returned by another functions. This makes functions a very important and powerful part of the JavaScript. Today, we're going to learn about functions. So let's first see how we can define functions. There are a number of ways to define a function in JavaScript. Technically three. So first we are going to see is function declaration. To define a function literal, we can use a function declaration. Let's head over to our index.javascript file and let's define a function called greetings, in which we're just going to log to the console hello. Let's invoke this function. Let's see that function in action. As we can see, it has printed hello in the browser. So if we closely look at the function declaration, this starts with the function keyword and is followed by the name of the function, which is in this case is called greetings, followed by a parenthesis. Following this is a block that contains the code for the function. This is known as name function as the function has a name, greetings. Second way to define a function is called function expressions. So let's go ahead and comment this out. And let's define another function using the function expression way. So in this case, we'll be defining an anonymous function and we'll be assigning it to a variable. Let's create a constant variable called goodbye. And let's create an anonymous function. And inside this, we'll again do a console log. We'll call it goodbye. And let's just call that function. The function in this example is known as anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. It is simply created and then assigned to a variable called goodbye. So let's go ahead and see if we are printing the goodbye in the console or not. As you can see, the function is working fine. So we were able to define the function in both the ways, the function expression as well as with the function declaration. Now the third way is by using a function constructor. So let's comment this out as well. And let's create a function using a function constructor. Let's define a constant again called hi. And we will call a new instance of function method inside which we are going to provide a string which will get printed in the console. If we go ahead and try to see, it has printed, but I would suggest that it is neither recommended to declare function this way, nor it is popular amongst the developers, as there are numerous problems associated with function inside a string, because you can see the way we define function, the code gets highlighted and it's much easier to read, but this way we cannot do any readability that what console is, and everything inside a string is very hard to debug. Let's talk about invoking a function. Invoking a function is to run the code inside the function's body. To invoke a function, simply enter its name followed by parentheses. This is how we would invoke the goodbye function. The function can be invoked over and over again just by typing its name followed by parentheses. This is one of the advantages of using functions. There is no need to write repetitive blocks of code. Another advantage is that all the functionality is kept in one place. So if you want to change part of it, you only need to update the one piece of code in the function declaration. This is known as try principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself. Let me show you. Let's just say we are calling this goodbye method couple of times. Now, if I save this, you will see the goodbye gets printed 4 times. But what if instead of goodbye, I want to print goodbye sayonara? Now the good thing is I have just made changes in the function at one place, but all the other invocation are just going to call the same function. So now all the outputs have been changed. Let's talk about return values. All functions return a value, which can be specified using return statement, which comes after the return keyword. A function that doesn't return anything, such as all the example we have seen so far, returns undefined by default. Let's see. If I go ahead and assign the value from goodbye method into a variable called return value, let's call it by it. And if we try to print that value in the console, you would see even though we are not returning any value from the function by default returns undefined if there is no return statement. So if I save this one and we go back and open, you can see the return value is undefined for this function because we have not explicitly defined any return statement or any return keyword followed by what needs to be returned. What happened if instead of the console.log we just return goodbye sayonara from the method goodbye? Now the return value would be goodbye sayonara. Let's check that out. As you can see, because we are now returning this value and this value is getting assigned to this variable return value. Parameter and arguments are terms that are often used interchangeably to represent values provided for the function as an input. There is a subtle difference though. Any parameter a function needs are set when the function is defined. When a function is invoked, it is provided with arguments. To see an example, let's create a function that uses parameters. We'll create a function that will calculate a square of a number. So let's define a function which we will call square, and it will take one parameter, x. In the body of the function, the name of the parameter acts like a variable equal to the value that is provided when the function is invoked. As we can see, it is multiplied by itself. Let's return x multiplied by x. So whatever is being provided as parameter, we are taking that parameter, we are treating it as a variable, we are multiplying that number by itself, and then we are returning that from the function. So when we go ahead and we call square method with, let's say, the value of 5.5, and of course we want to print this to the console, return value, would be somewhere around 30.25. If a parameter is not provided as an argument when the function is invoked, the function will still be invoked, but the parameters will be given a value of undefined. Let's create a mean function which calculates the mean of three numbers a, b, and c. We'll be simply returning the sum of all the three numbers divided by 3. Now if we try to console log the value of mean provided by 1, 2, and 3, it would work fine, and we will be getting a value of 2 because that's what the average of these three numbers are. What happens if I forget to provide the last parameter? I'm just providing a 1 and 2. Now the thing is, the function will still work, but it doesn't know the value of c. So the function gets the value of c as undefined, but now it doesn't know how to treat undefined in arithmetic operation. So it is going to give you back not a number as a result. Save this and see. As you can see, we are getting a not a number because it doesn't know the undefined value of c, how it needs to be treated. What happens if too many arguments are provided when a function is invoked? Well, JavaScript is smart in that case. What it does is that rather than complaining, it is just going to ignore the rest of the parameters. Let's see, I have provided 6 parameters here, but in our original function, we are just using 3. So if I invoke this mean method or mean function with 6 parameters, JavaScript is still going to give me the value by ignoring the rest of the parameters. What happens if we have a function in which we are not sure how many numbers of variables we'll be using, how many number of arguments I'm going to pass in the function? A better option in that case would be to use the REST operator. This was introduced in ES6 and can be used to deal with multiple arguments by creating an array of arguments that are available inside the body of the function. To use the REST operator, simply place 3 dots in front of the last parameter in a function declaration. This will then collect all the arguments entered into an array. Let's see that in action. Let's create a function named REST, and it takes n number of arguments which we are not sure. So to use the REST operator, all we have to do is in front of the last argument, we are going to place 3 triple dots. We're going to place 3 dots in front of the last argument. And JavaScript is now going to convert it into an array. And we can iterate over it by using a for loop, by calling it args, arg of args. And inside this, we can just go ahead and we can just log to the console. So if I call the REST operator function, with 4 parameters, and next I call it with 6 parameters. In both the cases, JavaScript is going to recognize all the parameters, going to convert that into an array, and is going to print that. As you can see, in the first case, it printed 1, 2, 3, and up to 4. For readability, let me do a console log stars so that we can see the changes. So in the first case, it just printed 4 arguments. In the second case, it found 6 arguments and it started printing all 6 of them. Now, with the help of ES6 syntax, let's go ahead and update and improve our main function. Let's define our main function again, but this time we are going to use the rest operator in our main function. So just in front of the values, we are going to put the three dots, telling the JavaScript that we want to use the rest operator and we want to convert all the values into an array. Let's define a variable called total in which we'll be saving the sum of all the values. Let's run a for loop on the array, and we are just going to assign and we are just going to add the values to the total. In the end, just return the total divided by the number of arguments we have got. So if I go ahead and invoke the main function with 6 parameters, and let's see if I want to print that to the console, I should be getting that number. That is 3.5. What happens if we increase the number of parameters and then decrease the number of parameters? Save again, check. So you can see in the first case it's 3.5 with more arguments. We were able to successfully calculate the mean of 8 numbers, and in the last case we were able to successfully calculate the mean of. Let's move on to default parameters. ES6 introduced a convenient way to specify default parameters for a function. These are values that will be used by the function if no arguments are provided when it is invoked. To specify a default parameter, simply assign the default value to it in the function definition. Let's define a function called hello, in which we are going to have a parameter called name, to which we are going to assign a default value called world, and it's inside the body. Needs to be function, and inside the body we are just going to console log since we have a default value. First we will be calling the function without an argument, and the second time we will provide a value to the argument. It's called hello, and the next time we are going to call hello, but in this case I'm going to provide the value, and let's see. You can see in the first case when we didn't provide any value, the default value was used in the function. In the second case I provided a value, so it overrode the default value and the value provided in the argument was. Developers used to do this inside the body of the function by removing the default value from here and then evaluating the name value and then assigning it like this. So what it does is that it looks for the argument. If there is a value, it assigns. If no value is provided, it will assign the world as a default value to the name variable. Now let's move to arrow functions. ES6 introduced a new syntax for declaring functions called the arrow syntax. These make declaring function much more terse by using less verbose syntax. Arrow function can be identified by the arrow symbol, which is this. That's how they are given their name. The parameter comes before the arrow and the main body of the function comes after. Arrow functions are always anonymous, so if you want to refer to them, you must assign them to a variable. For example, we had our square function. Let's try to write that square function again using the arrow notation. So I'll define it as a const square equals to, the first one is a parameter, so that will be x, followed by the arrow symbol. We just write x into x. So arrow functions have a number of advantages over other ways of declaring functions because they are much less verbose than normal function declaration. Single parameters don't need putting into parentheses like you can see in the square function. The body of the function doesn't need placing inside a block if it's only one line. The return keyword is not needed. Like here you can see I am not returning this, it is automatically getting returned. So the return keyword isn't required if the return statement is the only statement in the body. In the square example, x didn't need to go in parentheses because it is the only parameter. Multiple parameter needs to go inside parentheses. For example, if I create a function called add, which is going to add two number x and y, then I have to use parentheses to notify the arrow function that there are two parameters. If I define a simple arrow notation function called hello, which doesn't take any arguments, I still have to put the parentheses in front to notify JavaScript that I'm using the ES6 arrow notation. And then I can just console log hello. And by invoking this will work. As you can see. Similar way we can invoke the add by just putting some random number and square. And they all should work. And they would work. I just have to print them to the console. Save and try again. As you can see, it is printing 9, that is the square of 3. We're getting 8, that is the addition of 2 and 6, and in the last we're getting a hello. Longer function will still require curly braces to delimitate the body of the function and the return keyword at the end, as we will see in a complex but yet simple tax calculation. So here I'm calculating a tax, and it's an arrow function inside which we are doing an if else and we are returning the tax amount. Now, as we can see, a number of benefits of arrow functions are lost. Once a function body becomes longer than one line, arrow function makes perfect candidate for short anonymous function and not the long one. Function hoisting. Hoisting is the JavaScript interpreter's action of moving all variables and function declaration to the top of the current scope, regardless of where they are defined. Functions that are defined using a function declaration are automatically hoisted, meaning they can be invoked before they have been defined. This can be quite useful as it means that all function definition can be placed together, possibly at the end of the program, rather than having to define every function before it is used. So let's create a function. Let's call a function first. Let's call our greeting function again, and then we'll define the greeting. Now here we have defined a function greeting on the fourth line, but we are calling it on the first line. Now because JavaScript's interpreter can hoist That means it can move this whole thing when this script will run to the very top. So our invocation our invocation becomes valid because this function technically moves on the first line and this gridding moves to the bottom. Let's try to call it and see. As you can see, it is printing hello perfectly. What happens if we are defining the function in the other way and not as a function declaration? What happens if I assign an anonymous function to the variable greet, and then I'm trying to call it even before it is declared? Save it and see. It says uncaught reference error, cannot access greeting because initialization. So that means if I don't use the function declaration, then the hoisting of that function doesn't happen. We'll understand this much more when we are going to discuss the variable hoisting next. Variable declaration that use the var keyword are automatically moved to the top of the current scope. Variable assignment is not hoisted. However, this means that a variable assigned at the end of a function will have a value of undefined until the assignment is made. For example, if I try to log the console name and then I define the name and I set the value, let's say Alexa, and then I try to print the name again. Let's call it names to remove the ambiguity. Here, the first line is not going to throw the error because although we are assigning the value Alexa to the names variable on the fourth line, the name variable has been hoisted at the top with the undefined value. So if we are going to see, first it prints undefined because at the line number 1 it doesn't know the Alexa value has been assigned to the names variable. But when we come to the sixth line, it has already been initialized and that's why it is printing Alexa. Variable hoisting can cause quite a bit of confusion and also relies on using var to declare variable. An error will be thrown if we try to attempt to refer to a variable before it has been declared using const or let. It is a better practice to use const and let to declare any variable at the beginning of a block, so hoisting is kind of unnecessary. A function expression where an anonymous function is assigned to a variable is hoisted in a similar way to variables. So if it is declared using var, then the declaration will be hoisted, but not the actual function. That means, like we discussed earlier, if I create a function, let's say if I create a function var hello equals to an anonymous function which is going to print hello to the console. Now this method can be called here and it will work perfectly because it has been defined and the variable has been hoisted. If I try to call the function before it has been declared, then the hoisting only happens for this variable, but this variable doesn't have this value yet, and that's why you cannot call this. Let's try to save this and see the error. It says that hello is not a function. Exactly, because right now hello is just a variable. Let me show you. If we do a console.log and remember our good old friend called typeof, if you see the type of hello, try to see the type of hello before. You can see it is undefined. Let me just remove this part and show you that how the assignment has worked. So you can see it was undefined, and then when we assigned this function, the type of hello variable became a function. So that's it for the function today. I know this is just first part of the function. We have a lot to cover in the second part. So I hope you guys liked this video. If you liked it, just hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, and I'll come with more awesome explanation